That's it, sir.
Chris, far forward.
Mr Speaker, can I just take a few moments of my first speech in the House this year with some pleasantries and hope everyone that had a good break and wish everyone the best for election year. Mr Speaker, there are two things that I do agree with the previous speaker. The first being that people will make their decisions around how they vote around things that they talk about at the breakfast table or the dinner table, if they're lucky to have dinner that night, and they will decide whether the formula for a party is a mood for change or not. So let's talk about what people do talk about at the breakfast table. The power bill comes in, and I want to talk about specifically in terms of a community that I represent, and that is the Pacific community. The power bill comes in, Mr Williamson, and a Pacific family will be wondering how it can pay that power bill, because if you look at the Salvation Army report last year that shows in the period between 2007 and 2012, while the average weekly income for every household in this country went up by $54 during that period, for the same period a Pacific household income went up by $2 a week. So when they look at how they think they're going to pay the power bills, Mr Speaker, they will make a decision about whether or not they feel better under this government and the track record when someone else's household's average weekly income goes up by $54 a week and a Pacific Island family's average weekly income goes up by $2 a week. 27 times more as a national average than a Pacific Island family. That's from the Salvation Army report released last year. They'll also sit around the breakfast table wondering if Johnny's going to have a job. And they will talk about that. So let's look at the Pacific unemployment rate at the moment. 13.7%. Twice the national average at the moment, and they'll do that maths in their head, Mr Williamson, as to whether they think they're getting a fair deal and whether it's time for a change. So you'll see the Pacific community mobilise this year because they have felt the rough edges of the recession. This government has done nothing for them when their average weekly income has pretty much stayed the same for the last 6 years under this national government, and the Pacific unemployment rate means their families are twice as worse off than any other family in this country. So they'll do that maths around their kitchen table and their breakfast table, and they will make a very wise decision to turf this government. Mr Speaker, we are speaking to the Prime Minister's statement. John Key, the Prime Minister, the Right Honourable John Key, the National Leader, call him what you like. But over the course of this year, you'll find that he will have another title, and that will be Nigel No Mates. Because over the rest of the year, he'll realise, and he's already starting to realise, that his friends around this House will soon disappear, and he won't have enough when it comes election time to cross the threshold and to have a majority in this House. And he's already started making signals around that to other parties who he wouldn't accommodate in the past because it goes against everything in his political judgment that he won't go into coalition with these parties. But now, all of a sudden, Mr Key is Nigel No Mates and has to start thinking about who his mates might be post-election. And look at his mates that are propping up the government at the moment. We've got John Banks, who will spend most of this parliamentary year in the dock facing electoral fraud charges. That's a really good look. That's a really, really good look for this government. And who else have we got? Oh, the United Future leader, Peter Dunn, who in this House today was asked whether or not he has the integrity as a minister who was responsible for the security of documentation and security of information in this country, about whether he is the person that should be in charge, whether or not he leaked sensitive documents, and he won't give a straight answer. Well, I think the people of New Zealand will read behind the lines of that and realise that this government is being propped up by two MPs who are, I guess you could say, tricky or dodgy in that respect. And as this year progresses, old Nigel No Mates over there will realise that his parliamentary term will come to an end whenever he calls an election. Mr Speaker, this government is being propped up by two MPs whose time will soon come to an end. And also we're seeing this government trying to gerrymander its way back into government by not necessarily making the decisions around MMP that it should, trying to make sure it's got its mates back in this government by making sure that the coattail rule in MMP stays in, a piece of law that 70% of New Zealanders say suck. But no, this government is so out of touch that it will keep it there just to make sure, in the faint hope that one of those two get back in, they can still be the government. And who are the other options? Colin Craig. Colin Craig. That's the other. Look, even Maurice Williamson can't have a straight face. I didn't even say anything about Colin Craig. I just mentioned his name, and Maurice Williamson can't even keep a straight face. And this is the man that this National Party wants to do a deal with to stay in power. This government will do almost anything to stay in power. And Mr. Speaker, that is not a government that we should be keeping. We're looking forward to this election year, actually. There is, as Mr. Williamson said, a move for change out there. We're looking forward to going out there and telling our story about how this Labour Party will bring in policies that will help Kiwi families. And Mr. Speaker, we're looking forward, and we've already announced one piece of policy, and that is our Best Start policy that will look at investing in Kiwi children to make sure that we give them the best start in life. It will, as Sue Moroney's private member's bill is proposing, extend paid parental leave out to 26 weeks. And I think you'll find that most families out there in New Zealand who are looking to start families or have another child really support making sure that there's a good period of time when they do have young kids that mums or dads can spend time with them in that first 6 months. We'll also look at making sure for the first year of a baby's life that those families are getting $60 a week to make sure it can meet the needs of making sure that those kids can get the best start in life. In terms of early childhood education, something that Trevor Mallard introduced with 20 hours free ECE, that will be extended from 20 hours, Mr. Speaker, to 25 hours. And Mr. Speaker, when I visited Discovery Kindergarten in Whitby about a week ago, those parents who I spoke to about that part of our Best Start policy were more than happy to make sure that they could have some more hours available to them so they could either get more work or look for more part-time work as parents of young children. Mr. Speaker, the Best Start policy is about investing in our children, and I'm proud of it, and I'm really proud that we have laid the platform of what this campaign will be about for the Labour Party. It is about investing in our children, and we've heard too many extreme stories, horror stories, about children in New Zealand to not sit here in this Parliament and not take action. And I think my colleague here, Portal Williams, in her maiden speech spoke of one extreme case of James Whakaruru, who was beaten to death by one of his caregivers. And Mr. Speaker, we hear too many stories, horror stories of children living in poverty, and I understand that the stat is roughly about 1 in 4 children living in New Zealand lives in poverty. And in this House, that's not good enough. So the Best Start policy that David Cunliffe introduced a fortnight ago, Mr. Speaker, is one way that this Labour Party is going to go out there and tell its story in an election year to garner support. That Best Start policy will help a lot of families locally in my community. Around 1,500 new babies are born in the Mana electorate every year, roughly 1,000 in Porirua and 500 in the Kapiti area. So that investment will be a good investment for our children locally. Every $1 spent in those early years of a child's life, Mr. Speaker, results in $11 of taxpayer money saved later on in their lives in terms of education, health, keeping them out of the justice sector, and that is a good investment. Ask anyone on the street if you'd give them $110 if they handed over $10, and they would certainly take those odds. And Mr. Speaker, what have we had from the government on this policy? Well, it's just been scaremongering and more out of touch rhetoric from the National Party. So out of touch that even in a what you would call a relatively strong National Party area of my electorate in Whitby, they quite like that policy. And so, as you can see, Mr. Speaker, this government is full of rhetoric and is out of touch. And the people of Mana know that, especially when you ask them their opinions on policies like that, and policies like stopping asset sales. The government tried to hide the referendum result at the last election, but it was a resounding victory for those New Zealanders who didn't want this government to sell assets. Around 70% of people in the Mana electorate said no to asset sales. But what did this government do? Did they listen? Mr. Speaker, no, they didn't. This is a government that is out of touch. We are looking forward to this election campaign when people will make their decisions around what they discuss at the breakfast table, as Mr. Williamson said, and this government has a poor track record on incomes and jobs.
Dr. Kem
Mr.
Calder.
Speaker, a huge pleasure to get